Hi, this is Jim from TrekWorld. What if the famous alternate endings rumor wasn't fan hysteria at all, but a deliberate studio strategy Bennett literally nicknamed throwing tinfoil into the radar sets? There's a very specific kind of fear that only exists when a story is still alive. Not the fear you feel watching a finished movie, not the fear you feel reading a plot summary after the fact, but the fear that lives inside production itself, when the ending is fragile, and the audience hasn't even bought a ticket yet, and the entire emotional trick depends on surprise. According to the making of Star Trek II, the storm didn't begin in Hollywood. It began early in October 1981 with Leonard Nimoy walking down a street in a large city in China, where he was finishing work on the television miniseries Marco Polo. Then his eyes land on a newsstand, and the publication facing him is the Wall Street Journal. And there, in the middle of the world, halfway across the world from his home in California, Nimoy sees a picture of himself in Spock makeup, with the headline, "Does Mr. Spock die in the next episode of Star Trek Saga?" And the book states, this was the first Mr. Nimoy heard of the question that would ignite a storm of worry, doubt, and protest. That moment is chilling for one reason. It tells you the rumor is no longer rumor. It's public reality, so public it can find you on the other side of the planet. And once the question is public, the audience starts doing what audiences do. They imagine permanence. The book says the natural assumption among fans was that if Spock were killed, he would remain dead, and it adds that this is usually the case. Now here's where the book gets interesting, because it captures something that's easy to forget today. The argument wasn't just don't do it. It was how dare you do it. The book says some fans concluded that Leonard Nimoy was the person to whom they should address their grievances. And unit publicist Edward Egan recalls, there was talk of boycotts, and Nimoy was getting hate mail. Really vicious stuff, really uncalled for, and most of it directed at him. That's the part that feels almost surreal. Not because fandom can't be intense, but because it's aimed at the actor like he personally walked into Paramount and swung an axe. Nimoy in the book says he didn't take it personally. He saw it as a narrow attitude about what Star Trek should be and how much people should determine that.
The following program is brought to you in living color by TrekWorld.
But then he elaborates, and the tone becomes heavier. He says he was saddened by it, and the sadness wasn't just the male. It was the irony. Star Trek is supposed to be about exploring strange and frightening situations, to boldly go. And here were people trying to prevent exploration. So now you've got two pressures squeezing the same movie at the same time. Fans terrified about content, studio terrified about business. And the book makes the point bluntly, the studio worries and the fan worries amounted to the same, because if fans didn't go back repeatedly, the movie wouldn't make as much money as possible. This is where Edward Egan becomes the man standing in the blast radius. The book calls him caught between the concerns of Paramount and those of the Star Trek fans. And Egan describes the correspondence dreadfully seriously. He says fans think they own Star Trek because they saved it from cancellation, and they believe they can dictate what they want. He says he'd tell them, trust us. We're not going to mess this up. Wait until June 4th. And they refuse to listen. That line, wait until June 4th, is a time capsule. It's PR in its purest form. You don't have the experience yet, but it's also a confession. The studio can't prove it yet. They can only ask for faith. And faith is in short supply when the headline is screaming, "Does Spock die?" Then the book drops a fascinating detail. The Wall Street Journal piece included quotes from an East Coast Star Trek fan, an articulate person so concerned that she and a dozen other fans, all women professionals, it was noted, got together, did research, and took out a quarter-page ad in a film industry trade publication. The headline of the ad is quoted in the book, "Why is Paramount deliberately jeopardizing $28 million in revenues?" And the book explains the figure. It was based on a projection that many Trek fans would not see the film a second time if Spock died, and that his death would lessen profits of the movie's home video sales. That is wild. It's fandom as an economic argument. Built like a briefing document, and Paramount's public reaction, as reported in the book, was to be glad fans could care so much that they'd spend the money that paid for the ad. Then Nimoy comments on the research and the ad, and it turns into a kind of dry comedy. He says he never spoke to the woman, thinks she was well-intentioned, and doesn't think she blindly made up figures. But he calls the logic strange, and he describes her graph. How many people would see the picture more than once if Spock didn't die, versus how many would if he did? And Nimoy's analogy is perfect. It's like standing outside a record store while someone buys an album they haven't heard yet, and asking, how many times are you going to listen to that album? You don't know until you've heard it. He says he found that funny. So at this point, you might assume the alternate ending rumor is the studio doing damage control. That would be the modern assumption, because it's the assumption we've been trained to make. But the book complicates that story immediately. It introduces the alternate endings section by saying, the journal piece asserted that even the highest-ranking people at Paramount might not know Spock's final fate, and that this leads into the next phase of the events. Then it describes what happened almost 2 months later. A New York paper reported that due to increasing pressure prompted by huge amounts of mail, Paramount had agreed to change the ending of Star Trek II. The book says an unnamed Paramount source was quoted, "They have decided to shoot 2 or more alternate endings." Now here's the key. The book asks the question directly. Was there any official intent by Paramount to foster the rumor that an alternate ending had been written and filmed? And it answers, the answer is no. It then states that Paramount executives, as recalled by producer Robert Sallin, were in favor of releasing no information at all on this phase of production. It adds that Egan confirms he never stated there was more than one ending. And it says Gene Roddenberry, speaking before a college audience before the film's release, specifically stated he had seen only script pages involving one ending and had no reason to think there was another. So the book is drawing a line. Rumor happens, pressure happens. But official, we shot multiple endings. That's not what they say happened. Then the book offers a subtle explanation for how Paramount could contribute anyway. It says, if Paramount contributed at all, it was only by refusing to divulge the ending. It says, print screen to get the film booked into theaters in advance, ended abruptly at the point where Khan activated the Genesis torpedo. And it says this secrecy was coupled with a direct reference to Spock appearing in the next Star Trek feature, if there was to be one. That's a fascinating PR tightrope. On one hand, total secrecy. On the other hand, hints that imply the future. And when you do both at once, you create the perfect breeding ground for a rumor ecosystem. The book continues into May 1982 and describes a New York Daily News piece quoting Nimoy as not worried about the Spock death question, and stating he had no idea how the film would deal with the Spock question, while confirming he'd been approached about appearing in the next Trek film. And the book says concerned parties could read the article 3 ways. Spock wouldn't die. Even if he did, he could return. More than one ending existed, and talks with Nimoy were based on the Spock does not die ending being used. TrekWorld is proud to announce their first ever full-length documentary about Star Trek's Galileo shuttlecraft prop. From its earliest hangout at the 20th Century Fox Studio storage lot, to rotting in the sun, to a miraculous rebirth and a tour through NASA's Houston Space Center, to the USS Intrepid aircraft carrier, to the Star Trek tour in upstate New York. Everywhere this little beauty went, it was experienced by fans. And we have their stories, photos, videos, and memories that have never been seen before now. Coming this Christmas 2026, follow TrekWorld on social media, or visit us at trek-world.com for the latest upcoming information. Then the book summarizes the audience reaction. Most fans chose to believe Spock would not die, and because of disclosures that he would be killed, they tended to believe more than one ending existed. It calls that conclusion logical, but says it was arrived at without knowing all the facts. Okay, so far we've got rumor. We've got mail, we've got fear, we've got secrecy. We've got interpretation. But we still haven't hit the nuclear core, because the book contains a Harve Bennett account that is, frankly, brutal. In his interview, Bennett describes how he persuaded Nimoy to return by pitching Spock's death as theatrical shock. He compares it to Psycho and Dressed to Kill in how it uses surprise. He says they drafted it so Spock was killed in the first third of the script, and the studio loved that. Then Bennett says he's jumping to the next significant event. With the first draft script available only to the inner circle, an individual who had been sent her own personal script and pledged secrecy went to a Star Trek convention in London, England, and publicly announced Spock's death, and blamed Paramount Pictures. Stepping aside from the book for only a second, it was revealed much later after this book was printed that the actual script in question had been given to the Roddenberrys. Draw from it what you will, But the well-known fact was that Gene was royally ticked off at being removed from his position of power, beginning with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Bennett quotes the accusation, "They're killing Spock," and emphasizes she had personally promised him no details would be made public. He says this compromised the whole theatricality of their surprise, and that the betrayal hit every newspaper in the world, beginning with the Wall Street Journal. He says the impact was staggering. Everyone from the studio to Nimoy was inflamed. He says the studio then said, "You can't kill Spock." And then comes the part that changes the temperature completely. Bennett says Nimoy received everything from hate mail to threats on his family's lives, and was seriously and justifiably thinking of backing out. Bennett quotes Nimoy, "I did not sign on to be accused of murder," and calls that observation correct. So now the production is trapped. Shock is compromised. The original plan collapses, and Bennett says their thinking changed. If Spock was to die, his death would have to be the climax. Surprise was out of the question. This is the pivot point. You can feel the gears grind. And if you're watching this as a storyteller, you realize what Bennett is admitting. They wanted the death to be a surprise event early. Then the leak detonated that idea, and the film was forced to evolve into something else. A movie built around suspense, inevitability, and emotional participation. Bennett even talks about this suspense versus surprise thinking elsewhere in the same interview section. He discusses how he believes editorial choices create either surprise or anticipation, and he says he was always mindful of suspense versus surprise, with Meyer understanding that. And now we reach the phrase that is the heart of this story. Bennett says, "Out of this need, he created a policy he called throwing tinfoil into the radar sets." He says it resulted in endless conflicting statements about the death of Spock. He says, "None were lies, but all were half-truths." He says the policy couldn't restore surprise, so instead it established ambiguity. He says this was the purpose of the alternate ending rumors. He says the philosophy worked. Anger was diffused, and people saw the film with an uncertainty that restored freshness. Then he drops one of the strangest aftershocks. Bennett says perhaps in the long view, he should hug the lady who betrayed them rather than be angry, because the turmoil resulted in a much better picture. That is an incredible line, not because betrayal is good, but because it exposes a creative truth. Sometimes the wound forces you to rewrite the body into something stronger. How do you sell a catharsis that someone is trying to spoil? Because the book makes clear that the creators were trying to do something that would hurt on purpose, and they needed the audience to feel it, not resist it. Look at Nimoy's own comments later in the book. He talks about taking a chance and going over the edge, and says they wanted people to believe it, really believe it, and not feel toyed with. He says, "If you feel deeply about it, let the tears flow. This is a catharsis." He stresses that during the playing of that material, there was never any sense of a game. We're really doing this. That matters, because the PR war could easily turn the movie into a game. A guessing contest, a rumor hunt, a gotcha. And Nimoy is saying no, the experience should be lived in the moment. He's also asked in that section, "And there never was any alternate ending?" He answers, not that he knows of, and he certainly wasn't involved in an alternate ending. But he explains something that's deeply human. Before the film opened, and before he had seen it, he didn't know what it played like. He lists scenes he wasn't in. Funeral scene, a scene with Kirk and his son. Bridge scene where they gather and talk about feelings, and says until he saw it with an audience, he couldn't know the emotional curve of the ending. He says he'd get it from Harv on the phone, but until you experience it, it's hard to tell. Then he says when he saw it with an audience, he loved it and felt they were buying it, and it worked. That's the tension. The PR strategy is about preserving uncertainty, but the movie's emotional engine is about preserving sincerity, and those two things can collide if you're not careful. So tinfoil isn't about lying. Bennett says none were lies. It's about saying things that are technically true but incomplete. Half-truths, so no single leak can fully control the audience's emotional runway. And the book's earlier alternate endings section unintentionally shows how that ambiguity becomes self-fueling, because it gives the viewer a menu of interpretations. It describes how a single quote about being approached for the next film can be read multiple ways, and how fans built the most comforting conclusion: Spock won't die, or he'll come back, or there must be alternate endings. So here's the darkly funny part. The strategy works because humans hate uncertainty, so they fill it with hope, And hope is exactly what makes the final death scene land harder. The book's death scene chapter even describes the audience being very carefully manipulated in the reactor room sequence. It notes how you remember Spock surviving dangerous situations in the television episodes and ask, maybe there's a chance. Then Egan reflects. You're told in the reactor room Spock is dead. Scotty says he's dead already. You go over and see he's not dead. You get hope, and then you watch him die. And Nimoy talks about the instinctive choice of Spock straightening his jacket, thinking he's about to speak to his superior officer for the last time. Now connect that back to tinfoil. If the audience walks in certain of the ending, the manipulation fails. If they walk in angry, the manipulation fails. If they walk in curious, uncertain, willing to ride the experience, the film can do what Nimoy says. Let the tears flow, catharsis, explore it. So the hidden behind-the-scenes truth is this. They weren't just making a movie. They were managing the conditions under which the movie could emotionally function. And Bennett's account makes it clear it wasn't abstract. He says elite compromised surprise. He says the studio pushed back. He says Nimoy faced threats and considered backing out. He says they had to move the death to the climax. And then he says he created tinfoil to restore freshness. That is a complete dramatic arc, leak to backlash to creative restructuring, to PR strategy to emotional success. And it's not generic making-of trivia. It's an unusually specific case study in how fandom pressure, media leaks, and artistic intent collided before the movie even opened. And the book documents the exact language the key players used, right down to that unforgettable phrase, throwing tinfoil into the radar sets. Bennett says he might want to hug the person who betrayed them, because it resulted in a much better picture. Not because betrayal is good, but because it forced them to stop chasing a cheap shock, and instead it builds something more dangerous, a death the audience would know is coming, and still be powerless to stop.